excellent field botanist. He goes to the field, he makes relevas, vegetation plots, he knows plants in these plots, but at the same time he is excellent also in theoretical thinking, and he's working also a lot in macroecology. Then he moved to University of Vienna. He works in Rennberg Center, which is Department of Botany and Biodiversity Research. Is that correct? And there he's head of Bioinvasions working group. So his maybe main topic is biological invasions. He will be talking about it now. He is an author of a large number of highly cited papers, especially in invasion biology, but also in other fields. And he's also popular in Austria in media. He got a prize of Austrian journalist, Scientist of the Year in Austria 2 or 3 years ago. So it's not only like excellent scientist, but also excellent communicator and popularizer of science. He also contributed to infrastructure of research. So he's one of the founder of GLONAP database, which is a database of naturalized plants in the global regions. And recently with us, he also initiated the creation of Reserve Europe database, which is a database of time series of vegetation plots in Europe for the assessment of vegetation change. And currently we also have a joint project with France and other teams in Europe called Motivate, in which we analyze vegetation change based on this database, Reserve Europe. So really excellent scientist, excellent scientific communicator. I'm really happy that he came to visit us today. So Franz, now it's yours.
Yeah. Okay, what should I say after this introduction? It's really very difficult to live up to expectations raised by Milan. Yeah, thanks for showing up and coming here. Thanks for the invite, Stenka and Milan. Yeah, I can already say, I would say, long-term collaborators, both of you, in different kinds of projects or initiatives. And yeah, there are also many other interactions going on between, let's say, the two divisions of my colleague Stefan Dullinger and mine at Rennweg and basically Brno University. There are lots of people traveling from one place to the other. What I will do today, I was instructed to give a talk of roughly, I would say at most 60 minutes, and then there will be discussion. Yeah? It will be a broad overview. I'm aware, even if you don't know the details of your background, that you for sure have different backgrounds and levels of expertise on the chosen topic, and maybe also levels of interest. But I would like to make a journey on the reshuffling of plant species. And as you can see, plants is in brackets. Some of the data results I'm showing are also used from other taxonomic groups we sometimes use with other colleagues together. And of course, all of the work is done in large most is done in collaborations, sometimes in large collaborations, so many other people have contributed to that work that I present today. Let me start with an intro. The world of yesterday, and this world from an ecological perspective or ecologist's perspective can be characterized by these pictures that I show here to you. Pictures of what we may call intact nature or extensively used traditional landscapes, which is still the landscapes we have in mind if we think of our biophysical world. This world has become history, or is rapidly becoming history at least. Yeah? And that's quite a recent phenomenon. You don't have to understand what's on the left side of this figure here, but what you hopefully can see, these are all indicators of anthropogenic pressures, human activities that have consequences for biodiversity. Damming of rivers, water use, paper consumption, things like that. And what you can also see is that the graphs are rapidly going up. I indicated a break point that's around 1950. just within the lifetime of a human, I would say, we have undergone a huge increase of the impacts humans are causing on the biophysical world. That's also why we are talking now about the Anthropocene. And that has consequences, increasing consequences. To make this point even clearer, how strongly humans are now shaping the world, I would like to use or introduce this figure here. What you see is here the weight, the total weight of large land mammals. Basically all land mammals that are heavier than 50 kilograms, roughly. In 3 categories. In the center here, the weight of 8 point something billion people. The weight of humanity. That's already quite a big fraction. Not surprising maybe. But there is a second part in light gray that's also part of the human, ecosystem. These are our animals. Cattle, 1 billion cattle, sheep, pigs, and so on, in light gray. But there's a third category. The third category are usually the species we are studying, the wild ones. The weight of all living large land mammals nowadays is just less than 5% of the total weight here. Less than 5%. These are dozens of species. Yeah, for illustration, one of these pixels here, that's the weight of all elephants on Earth, but there are also all large cats, all antelope species, our deer species, and so on and so on. Dozens of species, all the charismatic large mammals, less than 5% of living biomass of large mammals. Beyond these pressures, we have other pressures. They are, of course, working synergistically. One is if we, as biologists or as botanists, think about how the world is structured, we often think about graphical depiction like this one. It shows you the world distributed into different zonobiomes, basically. Large formations of different vegetation types that are characteristic for specific climatic regimes. However, in reality, our world looks different. It looks like that. Meaning, what you can see here is the onset, start of significant use, when humans started to use a specific area for land use, mostly for agriculture. And what you can see here is that the world is there's one dominating color, it's pink. And if you look carefully to the right, you can see pink means agricultural use only started in the last 100 to 250 years. Yeah. That's also a very recent phenomenon. And basically, the vast majority of the globe that is used nowadays has become used recently. There are just a few exceptions, and from a Central European perspective, of course, we are an exception. Like Europe, parts of East Asia, and some other parts of the world, the cradles of agriculture, they have a long history of agricultural land use. From the perspective of organisms, agriculture means replacement, or at least changes of natural ecosystems, the ones I've shown at the intro slide. They are being replaced by fields, often nowadays by monocultures, or by forestry plantations. But these are all signatures of a rapidly transforming planet. Beyond, what you can see on a map, there's another phenomenon now reconfiguring the biogeography of the globe. And it's not shown on a map usually. But what has been separated, basically forever, because of biophysical barriers between continents, islands, but also on continents, this is now becoming integrated into one global trade network. You can see here the evolution of the trade network shown by the ship lanes, which were very small in reach, basically the European coasts in around 1500, expanding to a first global network a few hundred years later. But of course nowadays increased a lot to a dense global shipping network, which is superseded by other more rapid networks, for instance airborne transport by planes and other means of transport. Basically every place on Earth is now connected to every place on Earth for the transport of goods, of people, but also of species. That's somehow happened, I'm not sure, but I think we leave it like that.
I know how to switch it off because
you know it? You have my,
Yeah.
please do.
I hate it in my
Yeah, sure.
not available for this window.
Or why not? Nothing will happen.
Maybe here. Switch.
Okay. Just start. Thanks a lot. My co-presenter. Okay. So, taking... Yeah, some solutions are not so easy as the future. Okay, taking these different processes, changes induced by humans together, this is resulting in many different and severe impacts on how biodiversity is doing right now. But one aspect is it's also, of course, these are the underlying drivers why we have nowadays a strong exchange of species. In English, the term is alien species or non-native species. Alien species also are popular in other fields, and it's not about this species, but now it's stuck. No, or whatever. No, it works. But this kind of species, that's a picture, of course, not a plant. It's a mammal, you will guess, which was found in Vienna, actually at the doorsteps of our garden, brought from one of our two cats 2 years ago. Any idea what kind of mammal this may be? You can guess, of course, and it may be wrong. Don't worry. And it's fine if you don't know it. Yeah, it's difficult, I understand. We also had actually no idea what it is at the very beginning, but actually the cats brought, it's a marsupial. Yeah, it's a glider marsupial, native to Eastern Australia, sometimes kept as a pet. So someone in our neighborhood obviously kept it as a pet, somewhere it escaped, met our cats brought it to our doorsteps. We were first wondering what it is. Luckily our neighbor is a taxidermist, so he was very happy. But the story behind this is, it's of course extremely unlikely that something like that happens to basically the person or one person who is interested in alien species. For one species that's recorded, for one event that's recorded that way, you may expect hundreds, more likely thousands, of similar events. Species being kept somewhere, species escaping, plants and mammals, or animals in general. Of course, most will have encountered a fate like this animal, dying because encountering other biota that are stronger, or because of strong and cold winters, or whatever, but a small fraction of such events result in successful introductions. And that's basically the story behind this one personal event. For plants and animals, we have hundreds, even thousands of species being now established in all regions on the Earth, including Central Europe. And now I would like to open the questions I would like to introduce today. Basically, most of them I will touch on a global or large scale. So basically, what are the alien species currently? Where are the hotspots? How many alien species do we have? Especially plant species. What is the temporal dynamics of alien species accumulation nowadays? Are we in a phase of increasing alien species introduction, naturalization, or already in a flattening curve? What are the underlying drivers? And also, what are the consequences for biogeography, society, and conservation of the reshuffling of species? And what are the interactions of biological invasions with other drivers of global environmental change? And what will the future bring? Yeah. These are basically some of the questions I will touch, sometimes lightly only, on in this talk, but to give you a flavor of some of these questions. And of course, there's much more work that has been done, is being done right now to address these questions, but that's beyond the scope of one talk. So, I would like to start actually with the GLONAV initiative, also to highlight a bit how collaborative work nowadays in ecology can successfully be done, and it is very successful for me personally, also the way the work was being done, but also from the outcome that are enabled if many people or a group of people is coming together for a specific shared purpose. 15 years ago, a group of people that were much younger than, as you can see here, also including a Czech colleague, two Czech colleagues actually, Monza and Peter, came together thinking about, okay, let's establish a global database of plant species distributions. That was not available at that time. Of course, many data were available, but not an integrated database. It was also difficult in previous times because you need some infrastructure and analytical tools to do so. So it was basically also the right time. So we started this initiative, sliced up the world into regions, meaning countries, federal states of large countries, islands and things like that. And then we looked for data sources, for checklists of alien species for all of those regions. Together with many, many other colleagues. We contacted them, looking at all sources we were aware of, ending up and focusing on established species, only those that have become a permanent addition to local species pools, self-reproducing populations. That was unfinanced at this time, so we did it with our resources and our time. And also looked for other data. There are quite some challenges in doing so. You have to standardize the different data sources, taxonomically and nomenclaturally. So there are tools that allow to do so nowadays. That's the only way you can do it realistically, following established checklists of the global plant species worldwide. And also we looked for a number of other data describing the regions, species, meaning traits, and other aspects, to allow for different kinds of analysis, questions to be asked. I just would like to show a very few of the outcomes. Yeah, the data are publicly available. First, how does the world look like from the perspective of plant invasions? Where are the hotspots? They are shown here. The red big areas are those regions with the highest numbers of alien species, whereas the green are the regions with very few, the cold spots, few alien species. You see certain patterns, not totally surprising maybe, but still first time shown in a quantitative way. You see North America, parts of especially Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand. These are the hotspots of plant invasions in absolute numbers. And in total, about 4% of all plant species on Earth are established, naturalized, at least at one other region. And this is 16,000 species, for comparison. That's slightly more than the total native plant species pool in all of Europe, from Sicily to the North Cape, from the Urals to Portugal. That's already a really sizable fraction of species. A few of the species are really widespread on Earth. These are the top species, and if you're a botanist, you may recognize some plant names here, like number 1 here. For sure grows just outside here somewhere. That's a very widespread rural species in Europe. And actually many of the most widespread species are actually native to parts of Europe. An indication that Europe was often a source pool for many species, especially in former times when European countries and settlers colonized large parts of the world, taking with them also parts of the flora. However, the perspective I've shown before, you can also have a different perspective on the levels of invasions. What is the difference between islands and mainland regions? Because the regions we are looking for, they have very different areas. Some regions are big, other regions are small. The small regions often are the islands. So here you see the same data set shown in a different way. It shows you the percentage of alien species in the current species pool of the different regions we have here, meaning large red, how do you call it? Circles. Thanks a lot. Large red circles means lots of alien species relative to the native species pool. And you see now the large circles basically all fall into the seas. Yeah. Islands have very distinct, often rich and endemic species, meaning species that are restricted to the islands, but they have not very species-rich communities. However, and they are rather small. In total, a quarter of islands nowadays has more alien species than native species. And that accumulation happened really rapidly because many of these islands, especially the ones in the tropics that are far away from Europe, have only been colonized, at least from Europeans, just in the last 200 years or so. It's a rapid transformation of local species pools that's going on. We also focused on islands in a different study, now involving also other taxonomic groups, as you can see by the icons. Here are plants, but also ants, mammals, reptiles and birds. And we focused only on islands in the tropics and subtropics. So we selected 257 islands within the tropical latitudes. And we used data from the 5 taxonomic groups on the native species richness on the islands and on the alien species on the islands for these 5 groups. Because we're interested, how does isolation of islands, and isolation is a central part of island biogeography, of course, relate to the levels of innovations, and what are the consequences then in the long term for biodiversity of these islands. So what we did, accounting for other factors, because islands differ of course in many respects, we ordered the islands according to the distance from the next mainland to the next continent as a proxy for isolation. Yeah? So you can see here the distance in kilometers of the island to the next continent. There are some islands just a few kilometers away from the next continent. There are other islands that are really far away, several thousand kilometers. Okay? And you see here the different panels. And what you can see if you look on alien species across the taxonomic groups, there's a gradient, interestingly. The farther away the islands are, the more alien species you have. Whereas for native species you find the opposite pattern as expected by island biogeography. If you sum it up, it more or less cancels the two gradients, more or less cancel them out because they are opposite in direction. What does this tell you? It tells you isolation is not a driver for introduction of alien species by humans, because the introduction effort is so wide-reaching by humans that isolation is not the factor anymore. To the contrary, you get more naturalizations, more alien species on distant islands because most likely there are more unused resources. There is a smaller native species pool, and all other factors being equal, that facilitates establishment of new incoming species because you have less competitors. However, these distant islands are also those that have the highest levels of endemism, because the relatively few native species that are there usually are restricted to these islands. So that has quite some consequences in the long term for biodiversity conservation, because distant islands are really vulnerable to invasions, obviously, and that in the long term will also result in, most likely, in a strong change of the species pool, meaning that also species that are competitively outcompeted will face the risk of extinction, for instance. From space to time, we are complementary to this spatial databases. We also collected and built another database with colleagues that was led by a colleague in Germany, Hanno Sebens, collecting the first records of alien species in the region. What is a first record? A first record is when a specific species was first recorded in one of our regions. The first record, let's say, of Ambrosia artemisifolia, ragweed, you may know, in Austria was in 1883. So that's the first record for this species in Austria. I have no idea about the first record of this species in the Czech Republic. Let's say it was in 1902. That's another first record for the Czech Republic of this species. So we collected this data, and you can see here from many different taxonomic groups, basically from all over the world. Of course, we do not have for all records the first record. But we have a global coverage, as you can see more or less, across many taxonomic groups. And we have around 60,000 of such first records from around 20,000 species, because every species can have multiple first records from different regions. Okay? And then we looked into the dynamics of alien species accumulation in historic times. That's the central figure of this first analysis we did, focusing on 200 years of history. So from 1800 to 2000, the last 200 years. Further back in time, data are too scarce for many reasons. And then you can see here the number of new records for a number of different taxonomic groups and a trend line in red. What can you see actually? Most taxonomic groups are increasing in first record substantially. The red line goes up. Interesting, there are two exceptions, 1.5 I would say. The half exceptions are plants. There's no further increase, but there's already a very high plateau since 100 years of introductions. And there are two exceptions. Mammals and fish, where there's a decline in new records. And that's an indication that policies and norms, legal norms for instance, can make a difference in conservation. The reason why there's a decline is 150 years ago, there were lots of purposeful introductions of mammals by European settlers in regions like New Zealand, Australia, but also many other colonies. Because people wanted game to hunt, fishes to fish, or other species just because just they were reminiscence of biota at home. And that has changed. Nowadays it's impossible basically, at least legally, to release species in new regions in most countries, and that you can see for mammals and birds, because their regulations are easier to enforce than for other taxonomic groups that are smaller, inconspicuous, where you have still a lot of introductions. Why did we do this study actually? Because you may wonder, it's not surprising that there's still a strong increase in new accumulation of species, because the underlying drivers, as I've shown, are still going up rapidly. However, you also have to think, even if the drivers are going up, at some point in time, new accumulation has to flatten, the curve has to flatten, because we are dealing with a finite species pool on Earth. Yeah? And the finite species pool is still much smaller for potential alien species, because many species have specific requirements or are living in specific habitats, have symbionts and things like that. They probably will never become alien somewhere, because it's highly unlikely to impossible. So the question is, when will we enter this phase of saturation? Because all species that can be transported and naturalized in a new region have basically been already introduced. The story here is, obviously we're not yet in such a phase. We're still facing severe increases in alien species accumulation. And you also have to be aware this is on the country level, and not on the level of sites, of plots, or of small regions that maybe you are studying, because there you may expect still further delays in species accumulation of introduced species. And that's something we looked into with a database that includes data on plots, so small communities from different taxonomic groups, as you can see again here by the icons. And we are basically interested in the level of invasion of these plots and also the relationship of the local invasions with land use intensity. First, a main result here, you can see the majority of plots is not yet invaded at all. Only 21% of plots has at least one alien species of all taxonomic groups studied here. Yeah? Just one species. Meaning that nearly 80% of plots does not have one alien species at all. And that's a discrepancy to the high levels of invasions on a regional scale, like a country. And the most likely explanation has to do with dispersal limitation and time lag phenomena. It takes years, decades, sometimes hundreds of years, until a new alien species is able to sample and colonize on a local scale all suitable habitats. Even if the species is present in the country, it most likely has not spread to the full limit. That's why many of the assemblages are not yet invaded at all. However, those assemblages that are invaded, they show a gradient. There's a gradient, primary means primary vegetation, secondary vegetation until urban, to urban here. That's a gradient of hemeropy. of human influence. No human, very little human influence here, totally transformed habitats here that have been sampled. And what you actually can see, the level of invasion of these 5 taxonomic groups is increasing in concordance with the impact of humans on these habitats. What you can also see, if you look then more closely into these habitats, because in the database there is also distinction how strong the land use is in this habitat, is that in the habitats there's also a gradient. The stronger the land use within the habitat is, the more aliens. So there are 2 gradients. Land use intensity still modifies within a given habitat how many alien species you may expect. That's not totally new. If you're an invasion ecologist, you may have more or less expected such a result, but it's, nice. Interesting to see such a finding on a global scale given by the large data set available here. Yeah, and as I said, it's a snapshot in time, like many phenomena in biology, and you may expect in the future other outcomes, because it often takes a long time until phenomena that have been triggered by specific events, like introducing species or changing the environment because of human activities, fully relax to a new equilibrium. And this historic legacies, we also looked, that was already implicitly about historic legacies, but we also looked at some studies in these historic legacies. I would show 2 examples of them. The first one, as I've shown, species numbers that are being introduced are increasing rapidly in most taxonomic groups and most regions on Earth. So, quite a long time ago, 15 years ago roughly, studying only countries in Europe, we thought about testing if these historic legacies on the scale of countries are a strong phenomenon, meaning they are transferring what we then called invasion depth to the levels of invasions you can observe. And it was quite, relatively simple approach, I would say. We had, for 22 European countries, data from 10 taxonomic groups. And we had 3 sets of explanatory variables. These are proxies. Yeah, we don't have the actual factor, but these are factors that relate to factors that increase the likelihood of alien species transport and establishment. So we collected data for each of the 22 countries on population density, per capita GDP, and trade intensity. The number of species being introduced, that's a proxy of trade intensity. Per capita GDP is a proxy of wealth, of human activities, and human modifications of countries. And population density in a similar way. The larger the population, the more strongly modified the country. And we collected this data for 3 time steps, for 1900, for 1950, and 2000. So meaning we had data, for instance, for the Czech Republic, on the population density, on trade intensity, and per capita GDP in 1900, 1950, and 2000. If you're interested, you can have the data. No, but serious. So we had historic and recent data. Then we built 3, basically 2 models shown here, the most extreme ones, 1900 and 2000. Just these 3 drivers explaining the observed numbers of alien species. That was more or less a model. And we had 2 models, one with the data of explanatory variables from 1900 and one from 2000. Both models explained a fraction, sizable fraction of the numbers of alien species, fine. But the main question was, which model is better? Which performs better, explains more of the data of invasion of alien species? And interestingly, if you make such a model comparison, you find, or we found, that basically up to nearly 100%, the historic model outperforms the current, the recent model. And that's actually indeed quite surprising, if you think carefully about that. It means the conditions 100 years ago, like trade intensity in the Czech Republic, is more relevant to explain current alien species number in the Czech Republic than data on trade from now. That's really a long, long time lag. But but it's statistically highly significant. And that relates also, basically, if you go back mentally, I do not go back now, mentally to the data on the local assemblages, it also explains why you still have not so many alien species in many assemblages, given that there are obviously really extensive time lags for many species in many countries. That's also worrisome, because by implication it also means, even if we, theoretically, would stop, for some reason, if it were possible to do so, the introduction of new alien species, most likely the process of alien species accumulation will go on for a long time and spread within countries in addition, because of this inertia in the response of biotic systems like alien species. So, one prediction, not hard to say, you have to expect many more alien species in the decades to come. Another historic phenomenon we were interested in, and we studied it more recently, was, and now it's an animation, we studied the role of European colonialism on alien species. So what you can now see here are 4 European historic, because they have disintegrated colonial empires, Great Britain, Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands. And I show you now the temporal evolution of these empires. You see the years, yeah? The increasing spread first of the Spanish Empire, but you also will see that the Spanish one is also the first one to disintegrate. In the high time of colonialism, in the especially 19th century, you can see that a large part of the world was basically dominated by a few European powers. That's basically now the phase we're entering. You also can see Spain is now already reduced to a few, because American colonies have become independent, to a small empire in the recent 100 years or so. Whereas the British is now the dominant one, but now the disintegration starts. Yeah. The former colonies are becoming independent. So interesting, there was no database available on historic empires, so we built it by ourselves. And because we're interested in the legacy of European colonialism. If you think of these empires as structures, political, but also socio-economic structures, with trade networks, particularly within the different colonies, this may, most likely, that was a hypothesis, may have consequences of which species are being transported. More likely, the same species are transported and introduced between the same empires, regions of the same empires, possibly resulting in more similar species compositions in regions, alien species compositions, that have been part of the same empire. That was what we tested. I make it short. That was a rather complex analysis, so I wouldn't be able to do it, but a colleague of mine, Bernd Lenzner, a long-term collaborator, actually had the idea and also did the analysis on this paper. We collected data on alien species distribution from the CLONAF database, collected other data to control for current factors that may also influence alien species in different regions. And then the historic data on the colonial history, as you have seen here. Basically, we had derived 2 measures from this historic data: the length of occupation, how long a region was part of an empire, how many years, and the time elapsed since the empire has become independent, the region has become independent. Yeah? The longer it is independent, the less likely there is an influence, because there were other factors superseding the historic factors. And this we used in the analysis then. I'm not going into any analytical details. Basically, we had a null model of random empires reflecting similar empires and the actual empires, like the British one, and then we compared if there are significant differences between the random empires and alien species composition compared to the actual empires. Then we used this data to calculate mean floristic similarity between different regions of different empires and compare this. The main story and outcome is, of course, there are many other factors shaping which alien species you find in a region. But still, a significant factor is if it was part of a specific empire. So regions that have been part of the British Empire have a more similar floristic alien species composition than regions that have not been part of the same empire. That's also, I find, quite astonishing, given that the empires have now been disintegrated many decades, or like in the Spanish Empire, nearly 200 years. Yeah, and the longer the occupation time was, the more similar the regions were in terms of floristic similarity of alien species. Okay, most of the stuff was more or less global, or at least on large scale, I have shown, but now I would like to zoom in on Austria. Okay, that's Austria. It's exactly like that, it's not any different, okay? That's how we go to university. That's a field trip. So if you once go to Austria, please take a note how you should behave if you're going to the field in Austria. Yeah? Okay. Because it's more or less, it's not, but it's just very recently published, our second checklist of Austrian neophytes. I would just zoom in a little bit on the Austrian, but it's also, I mean, you have excellent checklists for the Czech Republic of alien species. Led by Peter Püschek's team, but in collaboration with the teams here. And it was a long-term project to do our second checklist, our second update of alien species in Austria, because it was a lot of work and there were also unforeseen problems, but now it's published in a Czech journal actually. And just to give you a reflection on how a Central European country, that's not so different from the Czech Republic actually, yeah, what is going on in alien species. Like on the global scale, we also have a very rapid increase of alien species in Austria. The first edition of alien species, plant species, was published in 2002. And then we had 1,010 taxa species, some subspecies and a few infraspecific taxa that were alien in Austria. That's quite a fraction. Austria has around 3,000 native vascular plants. 20 years later, it was published this year, the study, but the last data were entered in 2022. So within 20 years, we had an increase to 2,615 taxa, so basically 500 species more. That's an increase of roughly 50% in just 20 years of alien species. That's quite impressive. If you compare the first and second edition, here's the first edition, the old catalog of alien plant species, here's the second edition, then you see different categories here, how widespread and established the species are. I just go to some of the main quadrants here. First, most of the species are casual. These are species we do not include in the GLONASS database. We only include established permanent additions to local floras, such species. Casual means these are ephemerical species occurring just a few years usually before they are disappearing again. Of course, also established species often start as casual species at the beginning, only after subsequent spread to become established. The vast fraction here of 700 species that had been casual already in the first catalog are still casual. There are another 450 species that are casual that have not been included in the first. So in total, 2/3 of the species in Austria that are alien plant species are casuals. However, also interestingly, roughly 100 species, these two categories taken together, are already established, or at least locally established, but had not been recorded 20 years ago. These are really rapidly, more or less rapidly spreading species. That's also quite a fraction. The regions of origin of the alien flora of Austria, for sure of the Czech Republic very similarly, are climatically rather similar regions of the temperate zones in the northern hemisphere. East Asia especially, and North America, but also other parts of Europe. The other continents, especially the tropical ones, are much less represented, especially for the established species. And the southern hemisphere continents are also very underrepresented. Not very surprising is that the Antarctic continent has 0 species. And we also assessed, based on data and expert opinion, the impacts of alien species. Many have no impacts, of course. However, even if it's a rather small fraction, some of them have quite some impacts. And the important story is on a number of different activities ranging from environmental impacts, that's most relevant for ecologists, I would say, but also on agriculture, as weeds for instance, or in silviculture, some on human health, and so on. Especially species that are shown here in dark red, having big impacts, large impacts that are the problematic ones, and the impacts are also rising, as are the number of species rising. There will be a bit more on impacts a bit later, towards the end of the presentation. So, that was zooming in on Austria. Now that's for relaxing your eyes, yeah? Okay. Because now I would like to move for the closing chapter of the presentation to something different. If you're old enough, you know who this guy is. If not, you can ask your neighbor maybe later. A bit about the consequences of biological invasions in the Anthropocene. You see here this tropical island paradise with thousands of islands between Australia, Southeast Asia and South America. The tropic islands in the Pacific. Yeah, these ones. But you can also see Paradise Lost as the title of the slide, because I would like to highlight that it's not for plants, because such data are not available for plants. As I said, islands are characterized by many endemic species, not only for plants, but also for other taxonomic groups, for instance for birds. Until recently, it was actually unknown how many birds have been lost due to human colonization. Here I show you what you can see here. Maybe first I introduce it. For these islands, the islands were first colonized not by Europeans, but because Southeast Asian people colonized the islands from west to east. That was the so-called Austronesian colonization, yeah, of Polynesians, spreading from here to the most distant islands like Easter Island, New Zealand, and then even further to Madagascar. Madagascar, even if it's very close to Africa, was not colonized by Africa, but by Austronesians coming from here. So they were seafaring people that colonized these thousands of islands over several thousands of years before Europeans came there with Cook. When Europeans came there, they encountered still quite a number of species that have been lost afterwards, but it was unknown how many species had been lost with the colonization that was happening first there. And that was becoming amenable to studies because middens, compost heaps of the Polynesians, have become studied increasingly on a number of islands, not on all islands, just a subset of islands, a small subset. And there were bones of birds, for instance, which could be determined. And it could also be determined which of the bird species are still extant on the island and which have become extinct because there is no species in the current bird fauna on this island that resembles the bones you find in these middens. And this data was then used from colleagues Blackburn et al. To study, to extrapolate statistically from these known samples of midden data of extinct birds to the full number of thousands of islands, how many native bird species have become extinct most likely because of human spread and colonization. These are all, most of them species have never been seen by Europeans because they became extinct much earlier. And the most likely number is around 1,000 bird species have become extinct just in the tropical islands of the Pacific because of human colonization. So it's really astonishing. There are about 14,000 extant bird species on Earth. So and it was unknown, the scale of extinction. Of course, it was known, yeah, like the moas in New Zealand, and other species, that there were a number of bird extinctions, but the scale of bird extinction was actually unknown. For other taxonomic groups, we don't have data, because we don't have midden data, because of preservation issues. But you can argue a lot of other species also were lost. And one main driver was, there were two main drivers, direct hunting, overhunting of course, but another main driver was biological invasions. That's why I bring it up here. Like for the dodo, the poster species of extinction, yeah, it was taken on board by fishermen because it was very easy to hunt. Many island species are naive, you can basically pick them up. Yeah? Because they are not used to predators, especially not to super predators as humans. But they're also not used to other super predators as rats. The Polynesian brought with them the Polynesian rat. Most of the islands are colonized. And even if the birds are big, the eggs are easy to devour by rats. And even the big birds, the relatively big like dodo, they didn't care. Even if the chicks were eaten by the rats just besides of the adults, they most likely did not care because there was no evolutionary exposure to predators at all. And that was the reason for the demise of so many bird species in such a short time. So biological invasions have been major factors on species loss, especially in an island context, for actually thousands of years. For plants, we have much less of understanding. Maybe the scale was not the same, but probably it was also quite sizable, even if it's not, in many cases, not documented, so-called dark extinctions. In the IPBES assessment, IPBES, I think it's important to know that, is a global panel of biodiversity experts that are producing biodiversity assessment reports, very similar to the IPCC, that's maybe a bit more well known. 2 years ago, there was a special report of IPBES on biological invasions, and the key figures are shown here on the consequences of biological invasions in a global perspective. For 60% of documented extinctions, not the one that are undocumented, like the one I've shown for the birds in the Pacific, the one from the IUCN Red Data Book, 60% of those extinctions have been at least co-caused by alien species. Often there were other factors, and the main reason is also many of these extinctions happened on islands. Yeah, that's really a main factor of extinctions, especially on islands. The economic consequences, the impacts, agricultural losses, human health costs and other things by alien species are quadrupling, growing 4 times per every decade, so very steep increase. And alien species have different kinds of impacts, also for different sectors. Sometimes they can also be beneficial. They can provide new sources for food or fiber or whatever. But overall, 85% of documented impacts are negative ones. 15% are positive ones. So the negative ones are clearly dominating. Yeah. Basically, these are the headline figures of the report. So they're part of a deadly anthropogenic cocktail. Regarding the economic costs, just very quickly, what I would like to show. There's a database by colleagues that have, it's called INVACOST, Invasive Species Cost Database, where they collected from the body of literature, the economic costs of all alien species, and built up a global database of alien species costs, impacts and costs. And what you can see here, that over time, costs are rising, as I said, very strongly, the damage costs particularly, the costs for agriculture, for human health and so on. And you also have to take note that this is a logarithmic scale, otherwise it would even be much steeper, you cannot really show that. Whereas the costs for management, the blue line, it's also increasing over time, but much less so. The main story is under management, yeah? Because obviously every dollar invested in management is by an order of magnitude smaller by the cost that alien species are causing. And there is a discrepancy between the need of management and the level of effort spent for management. Another way to show the costs of alien species, so we made a comparison of the costs of alien species, invasive alien species, with the costs of natural disasters. So there's a database where you get the costs of natural disasters from 1980 to 2019, global costs. Yeah. And then we just ordered the different categories by declining costs. And what you actually can see, that's also quite interesting, I would say even a bit surprising for me, I had no idea before, is that the costs of storms are the biggest one on Earth. I mean, hurricanes and things like that, especially, but also large storms in Central Europe sometimes. But second come already the costs of alien species, before earthquakes, floods, droughts, and so on. So the question is, okay, why is the perception so different? Because yeah, storms or earthquakes make headlines, biological invasions sometimes do, but much less so. The reason is the nature of the impacts is very different. Yeah? A storm, an earthquake, basically all natural disasters are very rare in a given region. They're always very rare. Very rare extreme events with a huge damage, or at least with a damage in a very short period of time. So it's very conspicuous, it's very damaging when it happens. But when you have a flood, you maybe have not a flood in the same area for 100, 200, 500 years. So these are rare events. Whereas the costs caused by alien species is completely different. They are chronic. If you have agricultural losses by a pest species, you have it in a large region usually, every year. But it's people also get used to it somehow because, yeah, if you have a specific bug every year in your field and it's causing a certain amount of loss, you have to deal with it somehow and you get used to this new baseline. But they're not making such headline costs, even if the sum costs are very similar in dimension to big natural disasters. But it's good to visualize that, or have that in mind. Yeah. Take-home messages. That's just now, as you can guess, the last slide. Yeah, like in many fields, of course, but also in plant invasions or other kind of taxonomic groups that are studying by invasion biologists. The knowledge has increased a lot. A lot has been done. I mean, there are very different complementary ways to study biological invasions. You can do experiments. You can do many other kinds of greenhouse experiments whatsoever, transplantation experiments. There are many other ways to study invasions that yield additional complementary and very important insights. Here I was focusing more on these large-scale patterns, of course. But the one key message is collaboration, interacting with people and colleagues that have similar and shared visions. That's very useful in nowadays science. I mean, it's also what is being done here a lot in Masaryk University. If you look at the saturation, there are very little signs of saturation of alien species accumulation nowadays, as you have seen in several of the slides I presented. If you have strong increase in numbers and in the spread of species, that translates also in rising impacts on biodiversity, but also on human livelihoods. Even if it's just a subset of species that are causing impacts, the impacts are distributed unequally across the Earth. As I have said, for biodiversity, the strongest impact are clearly occurring on islands. Yeah. European countries or regions are not an exception to these general global trends. I just used the example of Austria. And that's it, basically. That's my team and yeah, funding institutions and some other stuff. Okay, thanks a lot.
So thank you very much, Franz, for this excellent overview of plant invasion issues, big issues of today. So now we have time for questions, please.
Okay, can I ask whether there is something positive on biological invasions? Because, let's say, thinking evolutionary, I think it can provide some opportunity to meet different species, to make something, let's say, better adapted for the future world. Is there some thinking about in this invasion science about that, or
shown, I'm showing just quantitative data here, and I think these quantitative data are reliable ones because from the IPBES assessment, which is the most comprehensive assessment on the available, the full body of literature on a given topic, one could see that 85% were classified as negative, or were negative, and 15%, as I also mentioned, have positive impacts on certain sectors. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a clear imbalance. And of course you can, I mean, there's lots of discussion on how you value things, especially in a field, and of course it's about value. If you think about impacts, you have to have a clear framework of which values you assign to what is occurring when a species is, let's say, spreading to a new environment. How do you classify and measure that? And how do you value that, or balance different kinds of impact? So the answer not always is totally simple, but the overall story is clearly, I mean, like as shown, the extinction, contribution, many other factors, it's very clear. But of course there are also certain aspects of alien species where they can have also a value, definitely for human livelihoods in a certain context, and from a biodiversity perspective in a certain, however, I would, personal opinion, it's also, my personal opinion is also based on specific values, of course, in a circumscribed, relatively circumscribed that's my personal view on that based on the data available. But I'm not sure, you know these debates, there are also, there are a range of, like always in science and in society, there are a range of opinions. I would say my opinion is somewhere in the more or less center of that, but you have of course a Gaussian curve of opinions. You will also find a few people who are very strongly, let's say, saying, basically being on one more extreme end of opinions or values, and other people who are more on the other side about the valuation of impacts, so see more the potential positive effects. But the vast majority of opinions centers about the data I've shown here.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering in the interpretation of the islands that they are more prone to invasion because of low richness, low native richness despite high endemism rate, and that somehow implies the existence of empty niches that are there to be. I was thinking of an alternative explanation where disturbances can be quantified on frequency, intensity, or extent, and of course islands, those small islands of the Pacific, are any disturbance will be very big in extent relative to the actual surface you have available. And many invasive species, at least in plants, are ruderal or fast-growing species prone to invade on disturbed habitats. So if it's not, rather than this more abstract explanation of richness somehow allowing other invaders to come, that the disturbances there are much more intense, have a much bigger role than on a much bigger landmass.
I'm not fully sure if I fully understood the point, because, just for clarification first before I answer, the islands, I mean, just a disclaimer after the talk. For all the studies, of course, all methodologically peak or essential assumptions have been left out more or less. I really tried to convey the story, because if I would also provide the full methodological approaches, I could not present all the stuff and it would also be quite dry, I guess. First. Second, I'm not fully sure because the islands were ordered across distance, not across disturbance. The x-axis was distance from the mainland. So what you are implying, if I understood correctly, would mean that there's a gradient of disturbance that relates also to distance of the islands to the continent.
Well, I mean, the problem is that those small islands are also, those isolated islands are also small. And any disturbance there will be much more influential to what happens there than
just for clarification, I mean, okay, we control for many of, like, area and other factors, we control for that. That's controlling for these factors, making the islands compared as equal as possible in the analysis. So I would exclude this explanation because of that. Yeah? Because it would could be only a factor, that's why I was referring to that, if there's also a gradient across this distance gradient on disturbance level, which I would not argue for, even not on the level of size necessarily. There are many small islands very close to continents, I mean, basically offshore islands, small ones. Admittedly, there are not so many bigger islands far away, but also sizable islands in the midst of the ocean. Hawaii, one of the most isolated island regions. The islands are not so small compared to many other islands. So there's not a clear gradient, so it's most unlikely. It's not very likely, but I mean, also my explanation, it's a post hoc interpretation. I would not argue that it's the only explanation. We also cannot test for it. It's a in my opinion, plausible, I would even say likely contribution to explain the pattern found. I would be sure, and maybe such patterns could play a role, but testing this would require additional and often data limitation would be. So I mean, it's hard to test in the end. It wouldn't need a follow-up study.
Because if it were empty niches, the newcomers would not affect or not so strongly the native plants. So
once again, sorry.
If it were empty niches, so low diversity there allows these empty spaces to be occupied by newcomers, then supposedly there would not be so much of an impact by the invaders.
Well, the study was not on impacts, it was on species numbers. Yeah. Impacts would be another dimension. I mean, to study in addition, then you would have to have data that quantify somehow the impact. But that's not like here, it's about presence or absence. Numbers of alien species. So it was not an impact at all. However, given that impact often correlates, if you have hundreds of, let's say, more species that have been naturalized, you also have more likely more species that are causing impacts because they are becoming widespread or dominant. So that's a relationship. But of course, also to test, we did not talk about impact specifically. However, you can hypothesize if you have more alien species, you most likely also have more invasive alien species in the region. There's quite some evidence for that.
So, other questions? Yeah, Bertrand.
Also, thank you for the talk. It was really clear and really interesting also for a zoologist. I'm a zoologist, and I'm interested in something unrelated. So obviously there is this huge effect of trade and colonial history, but are you expecting or have you even looked into the effects of tourism in recent years? So is there potential that it will reshape the distribution of non-native alien species globally?
I mean, for different taxonomic groups, put it like that, different trade is of course trade is a proxy for propagule pressure. One important aspect of moving species to another place is that you have some kind of propagules, seeds, individuals or whatever, that are moved by human activity across distribution barriers to another region. For different taxonomic groups, different activities are of different importance. For plants, the main factor is introduction for, let's say, horticultural purposes. That's most likely the dominant driver. For other taxonomic groups, it's very different. Yeah. Many insects are hitchhikers by goods. Yeah. Some were joining the trade of imported goods. Whereas for mammals and fish, for instance, purposeful release was a main factor previously, and now other factors are becoming more important. And these relationships also, what other drivers is changing over time. Some activities are becoming more important, like tourism, others are declining in importance. So I would argue, but I don't have data on that, yeah, that for some taxonomic groups it becomes or has become a more important driver. On a regional, local scale, there are studies that, I mean, then it's also about tourism. For instance, there is another network, I did not use any data of that here, it's called MIREN, Mountain Invasion Research Network, where, for instance, studies are being done along hiking trails in mountains and showing that hiking trails are corridors where alien species spread into higher altitudes, plant species. Yeah? Is this tourism? I mean, then you have, I mean, just saying, you can argue, of course, I would say it's tourism or at least recreation. And on the regional or local scale, at least in this environment, it's a considerable factor for the native alien species spread. For introducing species in certain regions, it's for sure another important factor in the subantarctic islands, for instance. Yeah? There is basically just tourism there, and research, not much more. And we were involved in a project on subantarctic islands on alien species, also climate change and alien species, and yeah, that's definitely a main driver for introducing species into these rather pristine environments. Yeah.
Thank you again for this talk. It was really wonderful. You show us a lot of numbers, but did you think about some other characteristics like similarity between native and alien species regarding, for example, those islands? So you said that endemic species are disappearing because they do not have a strategy to somehow cope with this alien species, so probably the aliens are very distant to them. So did you test something like that? I think regarding the phylogenetic similarity or diversity or functional one.
Yeah, interesting point. It's right, many more of the studies where we are doing were focused. Hey,
It's true.
Impressive.
Because you have excellent data, so I'm thinking that there's
many of the studies were focusing on, let's say, on numbers because it's basically also the nature of the databases we built in this global context. Of course, it's just, I mean, it's one, there are other facets if you look in biodiversity. It's not, that's a very general aspect. Biodiversity can be characterized by different facets. Species numbers, on what level, from plots to large regions, but also the composition characteristics of species are other facets. Yeah? You can look into, and of course they tell you potentially other, even maybe different stories. On a global scale, a severely limiting factor is, and you will know that because you're working on that a lot, other data. Even for, it's still a lot, I mean, even for global studies, 16,000 plant species, even the most basic trait data, for instance, they are not available. The only trait data set that's, because we used it for some analysis or looked for into it, but often we abandoned them, is growth form. If it's a tree, a shrub, or a herb, or so. Any other data, it's very good. Yeah. And then you end up with so many missing data that and this data are also biased. In Europe, species that come from Europe are much better documented. Species from the tropics you have much bigger data gaps. So it's quite a limit. And if you make comparisons with native species, the data gap becomes much more severe because then you have to have also the data for the native species. If you're interested in endemic species on islands that are by definition small range species, the data gaps are huge. So it's hardly possible to do that.
Well, maybe the phylogenetic information can overcome somehow.
For phylogeny, because of these large trees that have become available, at least, integrating many of the, most even of the plant species, it's more feasible.
I have a question myself, if I can. On the Austrian list of alien plants, the new one. So it was really surprising for me. What was the increase in the number of species? Because we had the first list in Czechia approximately at the same time as you had, and then we have a new one published 3 years ago, and we didn't have, I think, such an increase. I don't remember exact number, but I don't think it was so many species in addition. So my question is, did you also include some species in the new list which were already known in Austria before 2002 and were somehow overlooked when you were compiling the first list, or were found some herbarium specimens that the species was already there in 20th century, but detected only now?
Yeah, that's I cannot quantify the contribution. The basic point is, are these 50% of new species included genuine new occurrences, or partly, and to which extent then, a recording lag, because maybe they had been recorded already earlier but not identified, overlooked, or at least not published or whatever. A certain amount, I cannot tell you how, I have not even a guess, is records that have only been recognized or published after 2002. Yes. Still, of course, there's definitely a strong increase. Another factor is a number of very active botanists, field botanists in Austria, focusing, or at least strongly considering also alien plant species. So people like, maybe you know, Michael Hohler, and some other people really increased the level of recording also of very rare casuals. Because of course the number of casual is really driving the number of species you have. I mean in the checklist. But still, there were 100 established alien species, for instance, that were locally or fully established species that were not recorded in 2002. That's a sizable fraction of the 500 new species. So I would argue, I mean, the dominant driver is the new recording of casual species, but also the it's really a rapid increase of alien species. Yeah. And then, in addition, there's also some recording lag that species that have been missed before.
Okay. Better?
Okay, can I ask one more about what's the reason for the invasions? I mean, what part of the invasions happens because, let's say, climate is changing, so some regions get different climate. So the invasion, in fact, is let's say some natural process when the species change the distribution area. And what's really the impact of the human and transportation? Yeah, because okay, somebody can transport a species, but if they will not find a proper climate here, they will not survive. And so what part is, let's say, the nature or climate-driven process, and what other process? Is it known?
What's classified as alien species, and also before, I mean, the more or less standard classification in invasion sciences, it requires a transport of species or propagules from a native range to a new region, where it obviously has not been able to reach the new region by own means in previous historic evolutionary times. So there's a human action involved by definition, because species are, I come back to that afterwards. So in principle, all of the species included in basically all the studies here, but also by other colleagues who are dealing on invasion science, are only considering species that are being transported to humans. So not species that are following environmental change, like climate change or other changes, and expanding potentially the range to new regions. So that's excluded. Of course, secondary spread, once a species is introduced, let's say Falloppia bohemica, I'm using as an example, bohemica it's a hybrid that was described from the Czech Republic 40 or 50 years ago of two alien.
1950.
Sorry?
1950.
Yeah. In the Czech Republic, I think it was later because Czech published it in the 60s. But anyway, that's not the important part here. The important part is it was described here and then it's spreading across Europe by natural means, own means, and secondary spread. That can occur naturally. That's what you indicated. But the original introduction only happened because humans introduced the species or the parental species here, and they are hybridized because they came together. They have different native ranges in East Asia. The other factor that's also becoming increasingly important, and of course you may have cases where it's not 100% known what human contribution was, so borderline cases, that's natural, because it's a gradient of human activities that contribute to invasions. Another factor I did not touch upon that here is another set of species, and that's also becoming increasingly important because of these strong environmental changes we are causing, and with climate change has become a global phenomenon. We are entering a phase where many species, of course, are declining, but also a subset of species that will spread without any other direct human assistance because just of climate change. And but that's a different subset. These are not historically native species and also not alien species. They are in between. We also published and worked on that also conceptually. There was a bioscience paper that I coordinated a few few years ago that actually addressed exactly this gray zone in between. Yeah, but they're not covered. And that's becoming increasingly relevant. For a master's thesis by a student, we looked into the contribution of such range-expanding species for insects in Austria from newly recorded species. The main story is here that in the last 30 years, around 30% of newly recorded insect species, they are rather mobile. For plants, I would argue it's a smaller fraction, are newly spreading species on their own, mostly from warmer neighboring countries to the south, southeast, sometimes also from the east, spreading to Austria, for sure also the Czech Republic. Another 40% are alien species, another 20% are previously overlooked or undescribed or newly described native species. Yeah, it's an important phenomenon, but not part of these studies.
So if I may too, there is you didn't address it directly in the talk, but in the map of which countries or regions have received more species, North America and Australia appear very red, and at least in the case of America, it has been known that it has got many more species from Europe than it has given back to Europe, let's say. You know if that is just purely social, because we went there to introduce the species we wanted and we didn't take anything from it, or there is some other bioclimatic factor perhaps, or something more biological?
We looked into the flows basically from native to continents to the invaded continents on the continental level. For this alien species group, the global one. And the main imbalance is between southern hemispheric continents and northern hemispheric continents. Southern hemispheric continents are predominantly recipients of alien species, whereas native continents are predominantly donors. Though there's less imbalance between Europe and North America actually. I mean, that was one hypothesis, yeah, ecologically imperialism, that's hypothesis. Yeah. Meaning that Europeans with imperialism also exported predominantly alien plant or species in general. This was not the major finding in the full data set. There are also some imbalances between northern hemispheric continents, but the major imbalance is between donor regions in the south, recipient regions in the south, Australia for instance, or South America, and donor regions in the north, broadly speaking. Yeah. And of course this may also have changed over time. Yeah. This is something not yet looked into it. But that would be interesting to see if current patterns, because there's, like for Austria, and also for recent introduction other taxonomic groups, East Asia has become a major donor. With the rise also of China and other economies there, I mean they are the major exporters now on the earth. That has also consequences of exporting, obviously, at least for some taxonomic group species. 100 or 50 or even a few decades ago it was much more different. China was not really a strong player in the trade network like until the 1980s basically.
I think it's connected with agriculture, because Europe was not so naive like North America, which was that nature was naive to the alien species. So with any change, with great disturbances, so they were not, the native species were not able to cope.
Yeah, that's true.
Like also related to these empires, I wonder when you analyze the data on different empires, you found that they have distinct floras. The alien floras are more or less homogenized within the empires. But what was the main source of these aliens within the empires? Was it Spain or Portugal to the other parts of the empire? Or was there a significant transfer of plants within the empire from different colonies, like for Portuguese empire between, let's say, Brazil and Angola?
We had a network analysis, I mean I also didn't show here, identifying the important nodes, yeah, within each empire. Nodes meaning regions that play a specifically relevant role in the network and structure in the network. Yeah? And of course, I mean, that's a post hoc analysis, and I mean, then you see a pattern. This you can interpret. It's not like you cannot attach, let's say, the causal reasons for that. But what turned out that for the regions that had been very prominent nodes, they had as prominent, usually also prominent, but it's post hoc interpretation, as I said, role in the trade or economic structure of the empires. Like for Portugal, empire was, for instance, I think it was Java as the hub of the part of the Indonesian empire, part of the Netherlands empire in Indonesia. Because of the Spice Islands, it was a major hub with Jakarta that was early founded, and then obviously that served as a node for also spreading species. But I mean, post hoc interpretation, no test, it's just arguing, I would say.
But it's in the article.
It's in the article.
Yes, Nacho?
I have one question back on the checklist. Why didn't you distinguish the category of invasive species? Wasn't there an agreement on the criteria used, or because in the previous release there was this category distinguished?
Yeah, because we used what I showed here for the impacts. I mean, you can.
Yeah, I know.
We can. That's also what I showed. Yeah, I know that you know the data. What I wanted to say in the slide where I've shown the impacts, we had a graduation of impacts. Yeah, and then we decided to not assign a threshold where we could, let's say, speak or assign. Let's say this species is invasive, given it has the major impact and moderate is not. But that's maybe something we can discuss if you for your specific purpose are interested in adding. Yeah. Maybe we do it afterwards in a follow-up. But this could be done in my opinion.
Or maybe we can expect some.
Now, post-hoc selection on criteria of depending on your interest and also how it's being done in other checklists. What would be the most comparable approach? And then, of course, you can refer to papers, which I think perfectly fine.
Thank you.
Other questions? Students in the back? They want to know something?
You know, it's very dangerous if you have an urgent question and you do not ask it, you cannot sleep afterwards.
That's true, that's true. Okay, so if there are no other questions, I would like to thank so much Franz for coming here and